The general goals of this index is to increase the transparency of integration policies and provide public information on national policies, on changes in those policies, on international trends, and on the effect of international standards on national policies. Because this is our public aim, we see that researchers of all sorts have been using the past editions of MIPEX in order to enrich their comparative research. Go into the About section of this website and look at MIPEX in use. There we have brought together many forms of research articles and books that have been using MIPEX to improve research. And if you would like to add your own research to this, do not hesitate to write to us. From this, we see that MIPEX is extremely useful to improve quantitative research across Europe. These research findings have found that the MIPEX rankings are very similar to other indexes in this area, however limited those indexes are. We also have very similar distributions, finding that countries that score in a certain way on MIPEX tend to score a certain way on similar indexes looking at similar issues. Analysis of the index has also found that the scores tend to be highly reliable, meaning that they measure the same latent concept. For us, as we said, it is looking at this theory of change. To what extent can legal integration set conditions for societal integration through equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities? People have then been using MIPEX to look at country clusters to ask, well, to what extent do we see national models of integration? Is there convergence or divergence between countries? Are countries of Central Europe more similar than countries of Western Europe? And why are certain countries like Denmark or Switzerland outliers compared to their neighboring regions? You can also do quantitative analysis to look at correlations within the MIPEX data. You can look within a policy area to see whether countries that do one thing tend also to do another. So, for example, we find that the countries that provide voting rights for immigrants also tend to create consultative bodies of immigrant organizations. There isn't a trade-off where one is done over the other. You can also compare between policies. So, for example, we find that the countries that open paths to citizenship also tend to open political rights. Again, we don't see a trade-off here. We also see that the countries that work on labor market mobility also tend to promote family reunion. That means that the countries that try to help newcomers to find jobs also tend to facilitate their reuniting their families, whereas the countries that have many restrictions on family reunion also surprisingly have many protectionist measures within their labor market. This kind of research informs policymakers who often only understand a certain area of integration policy and don't see the complete effects and don't understand what they have in common with their region, neighboring countries, or with the continent as a whole. Again, look at the MIPEX in Use section to see all of the diverse ways that researchers are using MIPEX to analyze and compare countries. However, MIPEX is also becoming part of the whole jigsaw puzzle of how do you evaluate policies well? How can we isolate policies from all of the different factors that are at play with integration policy? Here, people try and oppose policies and outcomes. They have MIPEX, which provides them rich data on the policies available, and we have some data on immigrants' employment rates or education rates. However, this simple kind of arithmetic doesn't really say much about policy evaluation. It doesn't say anything about the time in which policies happen. People might have applied for a certain status or might have been most affected by a policy, but that's not the policy in place today. Also, policy works out very differently for very different types of immigrants. Policies on integration are just one form of the policy that are in place in a country, and whether an immigrant finds a job might have to do with the targeted services he or she received, but it might also have to do with the structure of the labor market and the general incentives for work in the country. So, research which just tries to compare policies and outcomes does not actually say much about the outcomes of integration policy. And in fact, we see many researchers who are calling for a more robust and systematic way of making the link between policies and outcomes. At the Migration Policy Group, we have given this a lot of thought, and again, under MIPEX in Use, you can look at our papers on this issue, and particularly the book that we published on this issue. However, I wanted to identify a few points that I think multivariate analysis must include in order to try and link legal integration and societal integration. Firstly, data needs to be collected on how governments are funding their integration policies. This data is very difficult to obtain because it's not publicly available. Also, it's difficult to capture what funds are working on integration. Are we just looking at the targeted funds that are labeled integration funds? Or are we also going to look at all of the funds that are available which might benefit immigrants and their integration? Secondly, we have to actually monitor the implementation of policy. How do we know that the policies on the books are also being used by people in practice? MIPEX does look at implementing measures. For example, where are equality bodies existing? Where do equality NGOs have a role in court? Where are targeted policies being adopted? How long do immigrants have to wait for a status? But governments are the ones that have to provide these performance indicators to look at whether authorities are actually respecting the law and whether immigrants are then using the law. Thirdly, we need to look at the discourse, because discourse is often how immigrants learn about policies and the opportunities that they have in practice. There's been a lot of work on discourse analysis, and I think that can combine very well with the comparisons that we see in the MIPEX between policies. Fourthly, we need to have better integration statistics to see how immigrants are participating in different countries. Now, more countries are monitoring their integration statistics, and we even see that the EU wants to adopt comparative integration indicators so that European surveys will better include immigrants in all of their social, economic, and political statistics. However, that doesn't say anything about policy's effect on these statistics. A change in the statistics might not be directly attributable to a specific policy change. For that, there needs to be, fifthly, more evaluations of the actual effect of a specific policy on the beneficiaries of that policy. Unfortunately, we find that few policy changes in MIPEX have actually been based on government evaluations. There are many reasons why governments make changes, but we don't see that many official and public evaluations that ask whether a particular measure had specific effects on its beneficiaries. And lastly, researchers have to start to gather the other factors that might be at play, which might explain a change in policy. For example, a change in immigration flows, a change in experiences of discrimination, a change in public opinion. And for that, they would have to create indexes of general policies that exist in countries, on the openness of the labor market, on political opportunities. They would also need to better gather public opinion data and opinion data from migrants as well. So while data in this area is often absent and sometimes poor, researchers should not be afraid of digging into this area, as long as they provide all of the caveats and limitations to what their research might be able to say. However, this kind of research will push forward our debates on integration policy effectiveness so that we can understand whether policies are being properly implemented by policy actors, whether integration objectives are actually justified, proportionate, and effective, or whether they might actually be counterproductive, whether integration policies are relevant and actually in touch with immigrants' individual experiences, and also to understand what we can and cannot do with our integration policies when there are so many social processes in countries of origin and countries of residence that might be too strong for a targeted policy to address. So I hope that all of this in our user's guide has helped inspire you in your own research with assessing, comparing, or evaluating integration policies, and we are ready for your results.